Every disaster begins before anyone realizes it has already started. At WWII 30 on December 16, 1944, the forest in the Ardennes erupted without warning. Artillery tore through frozen trees, shells bursting low in the mist, striking positions that had been quiet for weeks. American units holding the line did not understand what they were hearing yet. By the time they did, the attack was already moving through them. This was not a raid. It was not a local counterattack. It was the last strategic gamble of the war in the West, and it depended on speed, surprise, and weather holding just long enough to matter. The men in the front-line foxholes were tired, understrength, and spread thin across ground considered unsuitable for major operations. The Ardennes had been labeled a quiet sector. The roads were narrow, the forest was dense. Winter had locked the ground and the air alike. That assumption was now collapsing under artillery fire that did not stop. German infantry moved forward behind the barrage, followed by armor pushing through gaps that were not supposed to exist. The fog was thick enough to erase distance. Snow muted sound. Units were hit before they could fully respond. Communications failed early. Orders lagged behind events almost immediately. For the German commanders, timing was everything. Fuel stocks were limited. Replacement troops were scarce. The offensive could not stall. Every delay meant the advantage of surprise was bleeding away. The objective was simple and impossible at the same time. Break through, cross the Meuse, split the Allied front, and force a negotiated peace before American industrial power made further resistance meaningless. There was no margin for hesitation. The operation required roads to stay open, bridges to be taken intact, and American resistance to collapse quickly. None of that was guaranteed. All of it depended on days measured against fuel gauges and weather forecasts. The American response was fragmented at first. Units fought where they stood, often without clear understanding of the larger situation. Small groups delayed armored columns by hours, sometimes by accident, sometimes by refusal to withdraw. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles and advancing armor moving in opposite directions. The fog concealed both. As the German advance deepened, the shape of the attack became visible. A bulge formed in the Allied lines, pushing westward through the forest. Maps began to reflect what the ground had already decided. The pressure moved toward critical crossroads and supply hubs that could not be lost without consequence. At Bastogne, the roads mattered more than the town itself. Whoever controlled them controlled movement through the southern Ardennes. The American units there were surrounded before they fully understood the scale of what was happening. German forces demanded surrender. The answer was short and final. The town would hold, or the offensive would succeed. Weather grounded Allied air power for days, exactly as German planners had hoped. Without air support, the defense relied on artillery, infantry, and whatever armor could be rushed into position. The cold was constant. Ammunition ran low. Casualties mounted. Medical supplies ran out first. For a brief period, the German gamble appeared to be working. Allied lines bent, but did not break. The advance slowed under its own weight, stretched thin by fuel shortages and resistance that did not collapse on schedule. Every mile gained cost more time than planned. Every hour lost reduced the chance of reaching the Meuse. When the skies cleared, the balance shifted abruptly. Allied aircraft returned in force, striking exposed columns and supply lines that could no longer hide under cloud cover. German units began to run out of fuel in forward positions, forced to abandon vehicles that could not move. Relief reached Bastogne not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as pressure applied steadily until the encirclement cracked. The Bulge began to flatten. German forces withdrew under constant attack, unable to replace losses or regain momentum. By January, the offensive had failed. The ground gained was lost. The casualties could not be replaced. The strategic reserve Germany had committed no longer existed. The Western Front stabilized briefly, then resumed its advance east. The Ardennes Offensive did not change the outcome of the war. It clarified it. It was the last time Germany dictated the timing and location of a major battle in the West. After it ended, there were no more gambles left to play. What remained was withdrawal, delay, and collapse, measured not in weeks, but in the steady closing of distance toward the German border. The fighting did not end when the offensive failed. It thinned, shifted, and hardened. Snow filled shell craters. Wrecked vehicles froze where they had been abandoned. The forest absorbed the remains quietly, as it had absorbed the first artillery bursts weeks earlier. American units moved back into ground they had lost, often finding it changed beyond recognition. Villages were reduced to outlines. Roads were cratered and littered with equipment left behind in haste. The cold did not ease. Frostbite claimed men as reliably as enemy fire. The war continued at reduced speed, constrained by weather and exhaustion rather than strategy. For German forces, the withdrawal was as costly as the advance. Fuel shortages forced hard choices. Tanks were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Units pulled back in fragments. Cohesion preserved only where discipline held. There was no longer any illusion of initiative. The offensive had consumed what remained of Germany's ability to shape events in the West. Commanders on both sides adjusted. The Allies reinforced their lines, closed the Bulge, and resumed the pressure that had been briefly interrupted. German command shifted focus to delaying actions, buying time that could not change the outcome but might soften its impact. The scale of the war no longer allowed for surprises of that magnitude. The Ardennes returned to quiet gradually. Snow covered wreckage. The forest stood again, scarred but intact. What had passed through it left no permanent mark on the terrain, only on the men who fought there and the armies that expended themselves in the attempt. The offensive was remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it spent. Men, fuel, equipment, and time that could not be replaced. It did not break the Allied front. It did not force negotiation. It accelerated the end it had been meant to prevent. After the Ardennes, the war moved only in one direction. The line advanced east. Resistance continued, but without the ability to reverse momentum. The last gamble had failed, and there were no alternatives left. The forest went silent again, but the decision made there did not fade. It carried forward, measured in days until the Rhine, and weeks until Germany itself was reached. The men who survived the Ardennes did not leave it all at once. They moved out in stages, rotating to new positions, carrying the cold with them. Frostbitten hands healed slowly. Exhaustion lingered longer. The forest stayed behind, but the conditions did not. Reports from the offensive were compiled and reviewed while the fighting was still ongoing elsewhere. The conclusions were direct. The German attack had achieved tactical surprise and temporary penetration, but nothing more. It had failed at the level that mattered. The cost had been disproportionate to the result. The reserves committed could not be rebuilt. For the German High Command, there was no reframing that could change this. The Ardennes had been conceived as a decisive stroke, not a delaying action. It was intended to restore initiative and fracture Allied cohesion. Instead, it confirmed the imbalance of resources and time. The decision space narrowed permanently. On the Allied side, the response hardened. The shock of the initial breakthrough gave way to a colder assessment. The front had bent and held. The systems worked. Reinforcement, coordination, and recovery had functioned under stress. That confidence carried forward into the final campaigns. The winter dragged on, but the strategic direction did not change. German forces continued to fight, often with determination and skill, but without the capacity to alter the trajectory. Every engagement after the Ardennes was fought on borrowed time. Every mile lost could not be regained. The Ardennes did not end the war. It removed the last illusion that it might end differently. When the snow melted, it revealed ground that had been fought over intensely and then abandoned. The forest absorbed the damage. The roads were repaired. The war moved past it, towards cities and rivers that would mark the final phase. What remained of the offensive existed mostly in memory and record. A surge forward in winter, a pause, a retreat, a concentration of effort that could not overcome arithmetic. It was not remembered as a turning point because the turn had already been made. It was remembered as confirmation. The last stake had been played. It did not change the outcome. What followed was inevitability without momentum. The armies continued to move, but the sense of possibility that had existed, however briefly, was gone. After the Ardennes, no German operation in the West carried the weight of decision. Everything that came next was reaction. The winter battles bled into spring without pause. Units refit where they could, filling gaps with replacements who arrived younger and less prepared. Equipment was issued unevenly. Fuel remained scarce. The structure of resistance stayed intact, but its depth was gone. There were no longer layers to fall back on, only lines that shortened with every retreat. Allied pressure resumed methodically. River crossings were planned, executed, expanded. Air superiority was uncontested now, used not for shock but for denial. Movement in daylight became increasingly dangerous for German forces. Supply columns were broken before they reached the front. The kind of concealment that had enabled the Ardennes attack would not return. The Ardennes itself faded from operational concern. It became a rear area again, a scarred stretch of forest that had briefly carried the weight of a decision larger than it could sustain. The quiet that returned was not peace. It was the absence of relevance. For the German command, the consequences were immediate and lasting. Units destroyed in the offensive were not reconstituted. Experienced crews were gone. Fuel expended in December could not be replaced in January. The Western Front became a matter of holding as long as possible, not shaping what came next. For the Allies, the offensive reinforced a different lesson. Surprise had not been enough. Even under worst conditions, the system had absorbed the blow. That understanding removed urgency and replaced it with confidence. The war could now be finished deliberately. By the time the Rhine was reached, the Ardennes already felt distant. It had not delayed the advance in any meaningful sense. It had not changed timelines. It had only concentrated loss into a short period of winter fighting that produced no strategic return. The last gamble had been played exactly once. It required conditions that could not be recreated and resources that no longer existed. When it failed, there was nothing left to attempt. The forest did not mark that moment. The snow melted, trees stood, roads reopened. The ground gave no indication that it had once carried the weight of Germany's final offensive in the West. But the war that moved beyond it did so without hesitation, without pause, and without another reversal. The Ardennes had answered the last question. After that, there were no more to ask. The final months of the war unfolded without surprise. Resistance remained fierce in places, disciplined and costly, but it no longer carried strategic intent. The Ardennes had been the last attempt to change the direction of events. Everything after it followed a narrowing path. German units fought on because they were ordered to, not because there was ground left that mattered. Towns were defended, then abandoned. Rivers were crossed under fire, then crossed again in retreat. Each engagement shortened the distance to the inevitable end, even as it prolonged the fighting itself. The Allied advance no longer paused for reassessment. Operations were planned with confidence that opposition could delay but not derail them. Supply lines stretched forward uninterrupted. Air power dominated movement. The imbalance that the Ardennes had briefly concealed now defined every encounter. For those who had fought in the forest in December, the memory remained sharp, not because it had been decisive, but because it had been the last moment when uncertainty felt real. Afterward, the war became a process of closing space rather than contesting it. The outcome was no longer in question. Only the cost was. The Ardennes Offensive entered history not as a turning point, but as an end point. The last time Germany committed its remaining strength to a single, concentrated effort in the West. The last time it attempted to dictate conditions rather than respond to them. When Germany finally collapsed months later, the cause was not a single battle or failure. It was accumulation. The Ardennes stood out only because it was the final attempt to reverse that accumulation, and it failed exactly as the arithmetic said it would. The forest did not remember. It never does. What passed through it left no permanent scar visible from the surface. But the war that emerged on the other side was already decided. The last stake had been placed on the table in winter, under fog and snow. It had not been enough. After that, history moved forward without resistance capable of stopping it. When the Ardennes fighting finally slipped into the background of the campaign, it did so without ceremony. There was no formal acknowledgement that something final had occurred there. No line in an order stating that the last opportunity had passed. It simply became evident in how the war was now fought. German formations no longer attacked to seize ground. They attacked to disengage. Counterattacks were local, short, and designed to buy hours rather than weeks. The language of planning shifted from objectives to withdrawals, from breakthroughs to corridors. The difference was subtle on paper and absolute on the ground. The men noticed it before the maps did. Attacks came with less preparation. Artillery fires were thinner. Armor appeared in smaller numbers, often without infantry support. Positions were held just long enough to delay, then abandoned under pressure that no longer needed to be dramatic to be decisive. The Ardennes had consumed the last concentration of strength capable of altering tempo. After it, German command no longer chose where the war would be fought in the West. It reacted to where it arrived next. Allied units advanced into this new phase almost without comment. There was no sense of triumph attached to the realization. The fighting remained dangerous, lethal, and exhausting. But the character of resistance had changed. It was no longer elastic. It no longer rebounded. The winter that had once enabled surprise now worked against those who had depended on it. Roads clogged with retreating columns. Fuel shortages turned movement into abandonment. Vehicles were destroyed not by enemy fire, but by necessity. The retreat carried its own casualties, its own silent losses. By the time spring approached, the Ardennes existed only as a reference point, a place where the war had briefly tightened, then broken open again. It did not loom over the final campaigns. It explained them. The last stake had not failed because it was poorly executed. It failed because it was late, because the conditions that made it conceivable no longer existed in sufficient quantity, because time itself had become the enemy. After the Ardennes, time belonged entirely to the Allies. Everything that followed was shaped by that transfer, whether acknowledged or not. As the front moved east, the Ardennes receded into memory, not as a battlefield, but as a moment when the war briefly tightened around a single decision. The fighting elsewhere was no less violent, no less costly, but it no longer carried the same weight. There would be no second winter gamble, no new axis of advance that forced recalculation on both sides at once. German units continued to resist with discipline where they could. Individual commanders fought effectively. Local counterattacks still caused losses. None of it altered the larger movement. The line advanced because nothing remained to stop it in depth. What resistance existed could delay, but it could not redirect. The Allied armies crossed rivers that had once been considered defensible barriers. They did so methodically, with preparation and overwhelming support. Each crossing reduced the space in which Germany could still maneuver. The Ardennes had been the last attempt to create space by force. After it failed, space disappeared steadily and without drama. For those who studied the campaign afterward, the conclusion was unavoidable. The offensive had not been irrational. It had been desperate, calculated, and final. It was built on a narrow window of weather, surprise, and hope that Allied cohesion might fracture under shock. When that did not happen, there was nothing left to compensate. The forest itself offered no commentary. Snow melted, ground thawed, wreckage was cleared or left to rust. The terrain returned to its earlier quiet, indifferent to the scale of what had been attempted within it. The decision made, there did not require preservation by the land. Its effect was already irreversible. In the end, the Ardennes did not stand as a symbol of defiance or resurgence. It stood as a measure of limits, of how far force could still reach and where it finally stopped. The last stake had been placed on conditions that could not be controlled and resources that could not be replaced. When it failed, the war continued, but only in one direction. There would be fighting ahead. There would be loss. But there would be no more moments where the outcome itself was in question. That question had been answered in the winter forest, under fog and snow, when the last gamble ran out of time. What followed the Ardennes was not collapse, but contraction. The front compressed steadily, like a vise tightening without sudden movement. German forces did not disintegrate all at once. They withdrew, regrouped, and fought again, but always with less room, less time, and fewer choices. The difference was not visible in any single engagement. It was visible only in the direction everything moved. Orders issued after January carried a different weight. They no longer described what must be achieved, only what must be delayed. Towns were designated for defense not because they could be held, but because holding them for a day might matter somewhere else. Rivers were defended not as final barriers, but as temporary lines to slow what could no longer be stopped. The Ardennes had consumed more than fuel and men. It had consumed flexibility. Commanders no longer had reserves to commit when situations deteriorated. When a position failed, there was nothing behind it to absorb the loss. The line shortened not by choice, but by necessity. Allied forces advanced into this narrowing space with increasing coordination. The shock of December had hardened systems that were already superior in scale. Communications improved. Supply flowed without interruption. Units rotated without breaking tempo. What had been tested in the Ardennes now functioned with confidence. The weather improved, and with it, visibility returned permanently. The fog that had concealed movement in December did not come back. Airfields filled with aircraft that operated almost without opposition. Roads that had once hidden armored columns now exposed them. Movement became survival's greatest risk. For the German soldiers still fighting, the war became increasingly local. Defense of a village, a ridge, a crossroads. The larger picture receded, not because it was unknown, but because it was irrelevant. The outcome could not be changed by understanding it. Only the immediate fight remained. The Ardennes was rarely mentioned in orders after it ended. It did not need to be. Its effect was already embedded in every subsequent decision. The absence of reserves, the lack of initiative, the acceptance that the West would no longer offer opportunity, only delay. When Allied units reached the Rhine, there was no sense that a final barrier had been breached. It was simply another step. The war had already crossed its decisive threshold weeks earlier in the forest, when the last concentration of effort had been spent without return. The Ardennes Offensive did not fail loudly. It failed structurally, quietly, irreversibly. The war continued because wars do not end when outcomes are decided. They end when force is exhausted and space runs out. After the Ardennes, both conditions were visible, even if they were not spoken aloud. The forest had given its answer. Everything after was confirmation. By the time that confirmation became undeniable, there was nothing dramatic left to record. The war did not pivot again. It simply progressed. The Ardennes receded further with every mile advanced eastward, its significance growing clearer only in hindsight when it could be measured against what never followed it. German resistance persisted because the machinery of war was still turning, even as its purpose had narrowed. Orders were obeyed, units fought, casualties mounted. But there was no longer a strategic horizon beyond survival from one day to the next. The Ardennes had been the last moment when the future seemed malleable. After it, the future arrived on schedule. The offensive had demanded everything at once: armor, fuel, experienced crews, air cover deferred by weather, time compressed into a single winter gamble. When it failed, those resources did not return to the pool. They were gone permanently, expended in forests and frozen valleys that could not translate effort into advantage. Allied commanders did not speak of inevitability, but they planned as if it existed. Timetables were drawn with confidence. Logistics assumed forward movement, not contingency. Resistance was accounted for, but reversal was not. The Ardennes had been the last proof required that the system would hold under maximum stress. For the soldiers who had fought there, the knowledge was quieter and more personal. They felt it in the change of tempo, in the way replacements arrived, in the absence of sudden alarms that forced entire fronts to reorient. The war no longer surprised them in that way. The forest itself returned fully to stillness. Snow melted into mud, then dried. Wreckage was hauled away or left to decay. New growth came in spring, indifferent to the scale of what had been attempted there. The land did not mark the moment. History did. When the final collapse came months later, it did not reference the Ardennes explicitly. It did not need to. The last stake had already been played and lost. Everything afterward followed from that loss, even if it took time to resolve. The Ardennes had not saved Germany, and it had not destroyed it outright. It had clarified the limits of what remained possible. It had answered the final strategic question in the West. After that, the war continued only because it could, and when it finally ended, the path back to that winter forest was straight and unbroken, even if no one stopped there to look back. There was no moment when anyone formally declared the Ardennes to be the end. Wars do not announce the point where resistance becomes habit rather than strategy. That realization settles in slowly, through patterns that repeat without variation. After the winter, German units were no longer asked to achieve. They were asked to endure. Hold until nightfall. Hold until the next unit withdraws. Hold long enough for civilians to move, or for a road to clear, or for an order that would not change what followed. The language of command narrowed, stripped of ambition. The Ardennes had been built on a belief that disruption could still create opportunity, that Allied coordination could fracture under pressure, that speed and surprise could compensate for imbalance. When those assumptions failed simultaneously, there was nothing left to adjust. The model itself was finished. Allied forces advanced with a different kind of discipline now, not urgency, but certainty. Operations overlapped, fronts supported each other. Delays were absorbed without panic. The shock of December had hardened systems rather than exposed weakness. The forest had tested them at their limit and found them intact. What had been exceptional became routine. River crossings, urban fighting, encirclements, surrenders. Each carried risk and cost, but none carried the possibility of reversal. The war moved forward because nothing could stop it from doing so, not because any single action pushed it. The Ardennes remained the last place where time itself felt compressed, where days mattered more than weeks, where weather, fuel, and roads briefly aligned into a narrow opening. When that opening closed, it did not reopen elsewhere. German soldiers continued to fight with discipline and skill. That was never in question. What changed was the scale at which their effort mattered. After the Ardennes, no amount of tactical competence could restore strategic freedom. Every success was local, every delay temporary. The forest had absorbed the final concentration of hope that force could still dictate outcome. When that hope failed, it did not collapse dramatically. It dissipated, spread thin across fronts that could no longer be reinforced in depth. The war ended months later, but the decision did not wait that long. It had already been made in winter, under fog and snow, when the last gamble spent itself without return. By early spring, the Ardennes no longer appeared in daily reports. It had been folded into the rear, its name replaced by new objectives further east. What remained of it was administrative, casualty lists finalized, units reconstituted where possible, equipment written off. The battle was over not because it had been decisively won in a single stroke, but because it had consumed what could not be replaced. German command no longer spoke in terms of shaping the war in the West. The language shifted entirely to delay, containment, and preservation where preservation was still possible. Every decision after December carried the weight of that shift, even when it was not acknowledged. The Ardennes had closed the door on alternatives. For the Allies, the offensive became a reference point rather than a concern. It demonstrated that even under the worst possible conditions, winter, surprise, disrupted communications, the front could bend and recover. That understanding removed caution from future planning. The pace increased not because of overconfidence, but because the risk of strategic reversal was gone. The men who had held the line in December rarely spoke about it later, not because it lacked significance, but because its meaning was already clear. They had seen what happened when the last reserves were committed and failed to achieve decision. They understood that everything afterward would be fought in the shadow of that failure. The forest returned fully to its earlier role, terrain without consequence. Roads reopened, villages rebuilt what they could. The scars faded unevenly. Nothing in the landscape explained what had been attempted there or why it mattered. Only the direction of the war did that. When the final collapse came, it did not reference the Ardennes by name. It did not need to. The outcome had been set when the last strategic initiative in the West exhausted itself without result. The months that followed were execution, not choice. The Ardennes had been the final question posed to the war. It asked whether force, properly concentrated and risked, could still alter destiny. The answer had come quietly, in snow and fog, measured in fuel gauges, broken timetables, and roads that led nowhere fast enough. After that, the war continued on schedule. There were no more stakes to place. What lingered after the Ardennes was not shock, but a kind of clarity that did not require explanation. The war no longer contained unanswered strategic questions in the West. It contained only tasks. German units still fought hard in places where terrain favored defense. Rivers, ridgelines, urban centers were contested with skill and discipline. But these fights existed in isolation from any larger design. They did not connect to something that could grow or spread. Each one ended where it began, contained by limits that could not be pushed outward. The Allied advance absorbed resistance the way a system absorbs friction. Progress slowed, then resumed. Losses were taken, then replaced. Nothing threatened continuity. The Ardennes had been the last moment when continuity itself was at risk. When it passed, the structure of the campaign became self-sustaining. Commanders adjusted to this reality without marking it. Plans extended further ahead. Logistics assumed success rather than contingency. The rhythm of operations smoothed out. The war became predictable in its direction, even if not in its cost. For German leadership, there was no comparable adjustment available. The Ardennes had been conceived as an answer to a narrowing situation. When it failed, there was no secondary plan of equal weight. The remaining choices were reactive and incremental, each one conceding ground or time without gaining leverage in return. The winter offensive had consumed more than material. It had consumed the last credible claim to initiative. After it, the West was no longer a space where Germany could act. It was a space where Germany could only respond. The men on the ground felt this shift most clearly in what stopped happening. There were no more sudden, large-scale reversals. No fronts collapsing overnight and then reforming. No moments when the map changed faster than reports could follow. The war settled into a steady forward motion that no local success could interrupt. The Ardennes remained in memory not because it delayed defeat, but because it marked the point after which delay was all that remained. It was the last attempt to change the slope of the war rather than slow its descent. Everything beyond it unfolded along that slope, gradually but without deviation. In the end, the Ardennes did not need a closing chapter. Its meaning was already complete the moment the offensive stalled and began to drain itself of momentum. What followed was not a reversal, but a settling. The forest where the last gamble had been played returned to silence long before the war ended. Snow melted. Roads reopened. Trees stood again without regard for the calculations that had once depended on them. The ground gave no sign that it had carried the weight of a final decision. The war moved on because it could. The Allied advance continued with methodical pressure, no longer searching for the decisive blow because it had already occurred. The Ardennes had answered the last question the Western Front could ask. Germany fought on because it had not yet stopped, not because it still could change the outcome. Every mile lost after the winter carried the imprint of that failure, even when it was not named. When the war finally ended months later, it did not require the Ardennes to explain it. The outcome had been set there, under fog and snow, when the last stake was placed and spent without return. After that, there were no more gambles, only the closing of distance, and then the end.